This is Adrienne Herrera-Juarez. You're listening to Library Leadership Podcast, where we talk about libraries and leadership and speak with guests who share their ideas, innovations, and strategic insights in the profession. Wouldn't it be nice to have a guide to library management in a nutshell? On this show, that's what you'll get as I talk with Lisa Hussey, Associate Professor at Simmons and editor of the book Library Management 101, a practical guide. It's all here: how to deal with change and conflict, planning and decision-making, communication, and even respect in the workplace. Whether you're a current manager or perhaps looking at going into management, this information will prove invaluable. Enjoy the show. Lisa, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to learn from you, so let's jump right in. First of all, can you tell us why management theory is important?
It's one of those things that I think I'm a little bit different than a lot of other people in LIS who teach management, because I think management is incredibly important because we need to understand how we've gotten to where we are today in management. We need to kind of understand these seminal ideas that have kind of created the framework of what management is seen today. It's also incredibly important to me, and one of the reasons why I stress it so much when I teach it and why there's 2 chapters of it in the book, is that people have a tendency to grab pieces of theory and say, oh, we're going to implement X, Y, and Z, and here's what we need to do, without understanding the larger theory, without actually understanding that there's more than just, let's say with something like Kaizen, there's more than just, stressing quality. There's more than just, or something like Six Sigma, where it's more than just, minimizing mistakes. There's actually an entire culture that has to go with it. And it's really important when somebody comes in to say these things that, people in professional positions can kind of stop and say, okay, but what about this? And are we making sure we're taking these steps? And are we doing these things that are a part of it? And like I said, even more than that, to me, it's incredibly important that we recognize how so much of what we see of modern management started with Frederick Taylor and scientific management. And we still see this, today, this idea that counting works really well, that, you can take anything and put it in any setting without recognizing that in a place like libraries, what we do is not something that can be counted easily. In archives, you can count something like how many things you've processed, but that really doesn't get down to, processing a modern piece of paper. Is very different than processing a diary from 100 years ago, but they both count as one. And these are things that come up again and again when we're trying to, understand the best ways to run the organizations that we do. And if you have a good grounding in this theory, it really helps you build how you want to approach what you do within the profession.
It's a great starting place for sure. What is the difference between leadership and management?
Oh, this is one of my biggest pet peeves. I hate when these terms get used interchangeably because they really aren't the same thing. Management is about process. The role of the manager is really about making sure things go the way they're supposed to. And I'm going to make a few broad statements, and I'll explain them in a second. But the role of the manager is really to adhere to the rules, to adhere to the plan, to understand what the operations are supposed to be, and make sure that those things happen. The role of the leader is to actually inspire people to do things, is to really look at what the future is and understand how the organization can get there. The manager is all about how do we function where we are right now. The leader is all about where are we going to be in 5 years. Now, those are 2 very extreme statements, and I do want to say that managers often have to take on leadership roles, and leaders are often not managers. And that's one of the things that I really think can be important to kind of recognize, is that leadership can come from any level. It's somebody who can actually inspire others. It's somebody who can come up with new ideas and who has vision and, who can really kind of bring people to the next level. Managers are a hierarchical role, and they're, people that are assigned to certain places. And by the way, one of the things that also kind of drives me crazy is when, and I'm doing this a little bit right now, is when you compare managers and leaders, managers come out sounding horrible, and they're not. Managers are essential to a functioning organization. You can't have just leaders because nothing will get done. If you have a room of leaders, they're never going to listen to each other because they want to lead. You need to have a leader with vision, and you need to have managers who understand how to actually take that vision and make it work for the organization. And so, there are concepts that work together that are important for each other, but they are in fact two separate things. Just because someone's a manager does not make them a leader. And just because somebody is a leader does actually not make them in a position of authority. And it's something that I think is really important to understand actually how things work within an organization. You might have a department that works wonderfully, and it turns out that you have a great leader in that department, but they're not part of administration. And you might have somebody who's in administration who is who is a bureaucrat and who's doing nothing but exactly what has to be done, and the organization never goes anywhere because they don't have that vision to kind of see where the next role is. And so they're important concepts to understand, but they're not the same thing, but they work together and they're very important to each other.
Absolutely. A lot of interplay between those two roles. So how can we deal with change and conflict when we're talking about these things?
Well, first and foremost, people have to recognize that conflict is part of change. That when you introduce change, and this is one thing I don't think enough people kind of recognize, is that change, even when it's for the better, is something that's going to cause tension. It's something that's going to upset people. It's very hard to get out of a comfort zone, even when you know the comfort zone is not a good place to be. And that part of that process is going to be conflict. And that rather than fight against it, you need to kind of recognize that it happens, and how do you use that to actually move forward as opposed to try to ignore it? Because the absolute worst thing you can do with conflict is not address it or minimize it or act like it's not happening, because that's only going to make it worse. But the change, and the other thing is that one of the things that's really important is change is a process, and part of that process is in fact conflict. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how people deal with our changed norm soon, and what that means, and how people are going to look back on the good old days and the conflicts that are going to come up, and that people are not going to want to deal with because, well, we have bigger issues. No, you have to address the fact that when you're asking people to change, when you're requiring that it has to happen, one, you have to be open to the fact that there's a process, and that you have to, Lewin, who was a management theorist, had one of the best models for change ever. And it's 3 steps. Is that you kind of recognize the need for change. You unfreeze things. And what that means is that you actually kind of go through the process, and then once it's set, you refreeze it. And it sounds simple, but it's not, because that unfreezing time is when you have tension, is when you have people, resisting the change, working against it, being like, well, we don't need to do this. And one of the things that you can do as a manager and as a leader is to, one, listen when these things happen, to recognize you have to let people mourn what is no longer going to be. And that from there, you have to work with them, to be transparent about the process. This is why we have to do this. To give them space, but to not let them become mired in it. And to, again, address the fact that conflict is going to be a part of this process. People are going to very much, pick fights, for lack of a better way of saying it, that don't seem to be part of the change process, but are really kind of fueled by that change process, because people are upset. You have these growing tensions. And like I said, rather than just minimize it, the best thing to do is try to use conflict as a way to kind of grow, as opposed to rather than a means of destruction. And what I mean by that is like somebody saying, I don't think this is right, I don't think we need to do this, to say, well, what do you think the next thing should be? And have somebody work on that, kind of figure out that energy from that level, as opposed to just telling them, well, too bad. That's kind of how that has to be. When I was getting my doctorate, I did my minor in public affairs, and one of my professors pointed out in the class that was, to me, one of the most amazing things I'd ever heard is that for something new to happen, something old has to be destroyed. You know, when you kind of recognize that no matter what you do, even when you're changing something for the better, that means something's going away. And that's going to bring up a lot of issues that are part of it. And you need to address that. That needs to be part of how you approach change, is recognizing that conflict is going to happen and not avoid it. I realize that was a very long answer, but I'll stop there because I could probably keep babbling.
And when we do this well, it leads to our ultimate goal of providing excellent service. So what can make us most effective when it comes to customer service?
I think first and foremost, we need to always keep in mind that we are a service profession. I don't care where you work in the library or the archive or any other LIS institution. Everything we do is about an end user. It's not about us. We do this because we love it. We do this because we love what our profession does. But we're not doing it for us. We're doing it for somebody else. And I tell my students over and over and over again, it's not about you. It's about the person in front of you. And that needs to be a big part of our attitude in what we do. You know, this is one of the ways that you really can kind of stress customer service, is to kind of always remember that what we're doing is for others. And we have to always kind of keep in mind that we might want things one way, but that it's not about what we want. It's about what they need. And as a manager, as a leader, as somebody in a professional position, one of the best ways to do that is to model the behaviors, is to show that you care about that end user, and that's where your main focus is. And that, you know, don't get me wrong, you obviously always need to protect your employees. You know, working with the public is a very interesting thing often. But, you know, in the end, everything we do is about those that we serve, and that needs to be, we need to model the behaviors and show that that's in fact what we're doing.
Some of this also takes some planning and decision making. What can you tell us about that?
The thing to remember about both planning and decision making is that they are in fact a process. They're not just a step. And I would say with decision making, one of the most important things to me to remember is decision making is actually action based. It's not a passive process. And that you don't just make decisions, you then act on them. You implement them. You make sure that they actually take place, as opposed to just saying, I've decided this, and then think that that's all there's going to be. And that you actually have to engage with that decision. And you have to be willing to admit you're wrong when you've made a poor decision. And that's so hard. But part of decision making is not just, again, acting on it, implementing it. It's evaluating it. It's making sure that, you know, it's in fact happening the way you expected it to. The other thing is that decision making, you know, I mean, you can see in the literature there's, you know, different conditions for decision making, and you have like under certainty, there's different levels of, you know, under uncertainty and with no knowledge. One of the things that I would say is that we never have full certainty. You can never know exactly everything that'll happen. And that's part of what makes decision making scary, is that you realize you make a decision, you have the responsibility of it, and then you have to make sure that, you know, you have to do this without all of the information, because we never have all the information, and that something might go wrong. And you have to be willing to deal with that and address that as well. But, you know, ultimately it's up to you to take on all of that responsibility. With planning, the best thing you can do with plans is to recognize they are always going to change. No plan you make is ever going to end up exactly as you wanted it to. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing in any way, shape, or form. Plans need to be flexible, because nothing in our world is set. You know, the past 3 months can explain, there were so many plans for things like summer reading that have had to be completely overhauled, that you have to kind of completely and utterly rethink. Even when you don't have major things like COVID-19, things change. There might be issues with funding, and there might be positive issues with funding. You know, you might get a grant that completely changes what your original plans were going to be. You might have some new ideas. There might be some new thing in your community that's a part of things, and you need to actually be flexible enough to, to be willing to see it, to recognize that means you have to change what you're doing, to make decisions about what you're doing, and figuring out those next steps. And the last thing I would say about both planning and decision making is that it also should be a solo process. Ultimately, if you're in the management positions, you're the one who takes responsibility for it. It's ultimately up to you to say what's final. But the best planning and decision making that usually happens when you get as much information as possible. And that involves talking to not only the people you work with, but the people you serve. And it's, really kind of understanding that this should be a collaborative process. This should be something where you're getting input from a lot of different areas to figure out what is best for all involved, and not just what you think is best, but to really kind of understand what the needs and wants are.
And as we do all of this, communication becomes very important, doesn't it? What aspects should we be thinking about in terms of that?
One of the things that I learned, I want to say years ago, but I've had reinforced so many times, is you can't assume people know. This is something that I think causes a lot of bad communication, is this idea, well, everybody knows this, and so you don't actually say it because you assume everybody knows it. And in fact, one of the most important parts of good communication is not just making sure that you're telling people things, it's getting the feedback to get a sense of, did they understand what you meant? Communication is a complex process. It should involve dialogue, not just, one way, but an actual engaged dialogue where you're actually building a shared understanding of what's being said. When you're, doing your best to get feedback, to get understanding of what's happening, to make sure, to be willing to be asked questions as well as asking questions. And, that can sometimes be frustrating to, have to answer 100 questions. And one of the things, of course, to take from that is I obviously need to rethink how I'm saying this if it just keeps bringing up questions. It's understanding that you need to be criticized when you don't communicate well and figuring out what that means. It's trying to be as transparent as possible in what you're saying. And it's also understanding that you need to craft your message based on the audience. You have one message to give out, or you have one piece of information to give out, but how you tell it to different audiences actually has to be crafted for those audiences. You can't just have one monolith way of saying something, because you're going to lose understanding at different levels, and what's important gets lost in all of that. It's also, you also need to recognize how miscommunication feeds into that, and what you can learn from miscommunication, what you can learn from that process. That if you have a failed message, one of the things you take from that is, okay, what can I learn from this, or how do I fix this? And again, it's that willingness to be asked questions, that willingness to engage, not just to speak.
So important to have that willingness. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
One of the things that when I teach my management class, one of the things I always ask at the beginning of class is how many students want to actually go into administration. And I think the best I've ever had was 8 students in a class of 30. And one of the things I always tell them is, well, and I do it kind of a joking way, but realistically, is too bad you're all going into management. And what that means is you're going into a profession. You're entering as a professional. And what that means is you are taking on these responsibilities even if the only person you're managing is yourself. You need to be willing to understand what that role means. The other thing is management is complex. Management can be scary. Management has a lot of responsibilities. But when it goes right, it is one of the most rewarding things you will ever do. When you get your organization or your department, or for that matter, yourself, functioning in a way that you feel good, you feel confident, you recognize the benefits, it is so hard to top that feeling. It is one of the most amazing things you can do. And, going back to the customer service, when you show those things and you see how they're being reflected, when you model the behaviors and you see that being reflected, oh my God, that is so important. Because, there's, again, one of the best things I ever had anybody say about me as a manager was that, I might be tough, but I was fair and I was respected. And that to me is the beginning and end of all of management, is this idea of respect and not being respected. Managers have to earn respect, but going into any situation, the manager automatically needs to respect the people that are working for them. You need to respect, and you always, always, always need to respect people as people. And that to me is where good management begins and ends.
Thank you for that. Do you have any favorite books or resources you'd like to share, and why?
I was going to say two theorists that underlie almost everything that I do with management, and they're not from LIS, is Peter Drucker and Douglas McGregor. Peter Drucker was basically relevant in management for over 60 years, up until the day he died. And part of that was because he understood the flexibility and the changing of time and the focus on the individual. There's a great book, which is leadership book about leading or managing the nonprofit. And anybody in LIS, it's a great read. It's actually a short read. It's not a very big book, and he's actually very easy to read. But what he did was he actually went out and interviewed like people who run hospitals, people who run churches, people who run the Girl Scouts, and talked about, found out what were things that really made them effective and what they did. And one of the things he really drove home, and I've always thought this was really important, is that recognizing that ultimately the task is not about you, it's about the organization. And that the best way you can leave an organization is that when you're gone, it survives beyond you. And that's one of the most important things, one of the biggest focuses for leaders and managers should be that you could leave and somebody can come in behind you and you can still be successful. That's when you're successful at what you do. Douglas McGregor, who's known for Theory X and Y, which minimizes what he does, but it's the human side of enterprise is his book. The big focus in that is kind of recognizing the employee for the employee. My favorite quote by him is that we hire adults and treat them like children. And what's really important is we hire people to do their work. We need to trust them to do the work, to give them the space to do the work, and to give them feedback, to be honest with them, and treat them like adults and let them actually succeed. And those are two of the most important things in there. There's a great article by Camilla Alire about the human side of management, or the humanistic management. And my students have been reading that for over a decade. She brings in a lot of these ideas that McGregor talks about, that Drucker talks about. And that's a really good article for somebody who really wants to get a good sense of what it means to look beyond yourself as a manager.
Those sound like great resources. Thank you. Lisa, in closing, what do libraries mean to you personally?
Libraries have been a part of my life for my whole life. I don't remember not knowing what a library is. They've been a refuge for me. They've been, a place that just, they're a happy place for me. Which I know sounds a little weird, but they're a place that are incredibly important to me. And I think they're incredibly important to us as a larger society. I've devoted my life to them at this point in time. But I think they're also one of the most important institutions we have in the United States, really, especially public libraries. They're one of the last public spaces available. And, there's something that we need to fight for tooth and nail, because they have so much potential and they provide so much for our communities. And I can't imagine a world without libraries. And I grew up with two amazing librarians in my family, my dad's mother and my mother's sister. So libraries have always been an important central part of my life. And I think they're, again, one of the best institutions that we have in our current society, especially here in the United States.
That is just marvelous. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the show with me today and sharing so many important concepts that we should take away as leaders and managers in our organizations.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it very much.
It's been a pleasure. Listeners, if you would like to support this content and more like it, you can become a patron at libraryleadershippodcast.com. Thank you for your help. You've been listening to Library Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Adrienne Herrick Juarez. Our producer is Nate Vineyard. More episodes can be found at libraryleadershippodcast.com, where you can now subscribe to have new shows delivered right into your email inbox. You can also find the show on Apple iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.